He ruled through fear, impaled by the hundreds, and drank the stench of death. But in his final hours, even the devil recoiled. In the dying winter of the year 1476, among the blackened trees of Wallachia and beneath skies forever cloaked in ash and omen, the man once called a savior, a demon, a prince, and a butcher met his final reckoning, not with the clang of swords, but in silence, shadows, and betrayal so foul it stank of hell itself. This is the story not of how Vlad the Impaler ruled, but how he died, humiliated, disfigured, consumed by fever, betrayed by kin, and dismembered like the cattle he once fed to crows. Beneath the myth of Dracula lies the rotting corpse of a man eaten alive by war, paranoia, and the slow dripping poison of power. His death, like his life, was a spectacle of terror, but this time, it was his own body on the stake. The year is 1476, and the soil of Wallachia, cracked and bitter from decades of war and harvestless winters, trembles beneath the hooves of mercenaries who speak in foreign tongues and curse the land they are paid to protect. Overhead, a sky the color of rotting parchment hangs low over the withered forests, and the wind carries not birdsong, but the dry rattle of leafless branches and the thin, ululating cry of mothers burying their infants in pits too shallow to forget. Through this cursed and blood-soaked landscape, Vlad the Impaler returns, not as a savior, not even as a man, but as something far more unsettling, a revenant monarch, hollow-eyed and waxen, dragging behind him the stench of exile and the invisible weight of too many unburied corpses. His once proud standard, the dragon banner of House Dracula, flutters limply in the fetid air, now more rag than relic, its crimson threads soaked not in dye, but in the sweat and blood of the desperate. The castle at Targoviste, which in brighter times had echoed with the laughter of princes and the ringing of silver goblets, now stands like a mausoleum, blackened, crumbling and veined with moss and mildew, its stone bones gnawed by time and rodents alike. Ivy strangles the walls. The great hall, where once noblemen bowed and musicians played, reeks of mildew, burned parchment, and long decayed food. The throne itself, worm-eaten and slick with mold, bears claw marks from rats, or worse, from the hands of a ruler who once gripped its arms in fits of madness. And into this charnel house of fading power steps Vlad, gaunt as famine and pale as moonlight, his eyes ringed in violet shadows so deep they seem to rot into the skull. His robes, once heavy brocade, now cling to his sagging frame like a shroud, stiff with dried sweat and human excretion. His skin, tight and papery over bone, peels at the edges of old wounds, revealing raw flesh beneath. His lips, chewed raw by anxious teeth, move constantly, whispering half prayers and half curses in Church Slavonic, Latin, and a language no one dares name. He does not speak to his people. He does not bow to his priests. Instead, he climbs the steps to his worm-infested throne, dragging one foot behind him like a corpse, unwilling to stay buried. The hall is silent, save for the labored wheeze of his breath and the soft squelch of blood-soaked bandages hidden beneath his cloak. Servants avert their eyes. One of them vomits into a pewter basin and is dragged away by guards before the sound has faded. A single candle flickers behind the dais, casting long, sickly shadows that tremble with every exhale of wind, or perhaps with the restless presence of something far older than the prince himself. For Vlad believes, in his festering fever dream, that angels hover at the edge of sight, not to bless, but to judge, not clothed in white, but robed in the burnt wings of the fallen. He looks up and murmurs, "Ego sum vermis in throno." I am the worm upon the throne. He orders no feast. Instead, he demands silence, and for the crucifixes in the hall to be turned inward, facing the walls, for he can no longer stand to look upon them. "They watch me," he hisses to his steward, a trembling man with weeping sores along his neck. "They weep when I sleep and gnash their teeth when I rise." The commoners, hollow-eyed and limping, line the roads in silence as Vlad rides through villages choked with fog and carrion birds. They do not cheer, they do not kneel. They watch, slack-jawed, as their prince, once their protector, now their omen, passes by like a ghost on a dying horse. Children whisper that he brings the plague in his breath. Old women clutch rosaries until their knuckles crack. One boy dares to cry out, "Dracula!" only to be silenced by his father's hand and the wet snap of a bone broken in haste. In one village, someone has hung a cross upside down. In another, a black lamb is nailed to a doorpost, its entrails coiled like a wreath. Superstition blooms where hope has died. And Vlad? He smiles, not with joy, but with a gash-toothed grimace that splits his crusted lips and leaks a trickle of blood down his chin. He smells of garlic rotting in cloth, of old sweat and stale wine, of iron and linen never cleaned, of human decay, the scent not of a king, but of something far older and more terrible than royalty. A man who no longer fears death because he believes death has already taken him and left the husk behind. And thus begins the final reign of Vlad the Impaler, not in triumph, but in putrefaction. The throne groans beneath his weight, and somewhere in the damp stone below the palace, a worm turns in the dark. He continued to hold court as if nothing was amiss, seated atop his worm-eaten throne, a relic draped in rags of velvet now crusted with blood, bile, and filth. His voice, when it came, was strained and crackling, the tone of a man half drowned, thick with phlegm, and the metallic tang of internal bleeding. Courtiers bowed low, not out of loyalty, but to shield their noses and eyes from the sight and stench of their sovereign, a creature of nobility in name alone, who now resembled more a leper than a prince. He wore gloves to hide the peeling skin of his hands, but they seeped with discharge by mid-morning, leaving dark stains on scrolls, goblets, even the crucifix he clutched compulsively between muttered prayers that veered suddenly into curses. One morning, as he clutched an icon of the Virgin Mary, blood spurted from a ruptured lesion on his chest, painting the figure's porcelain face in crimson tears. Vlad, upon seeing it, laughed for nearly an hour, a high, thin, rasping cackle that ended in a choking fit so violent, he collapsed forward, convulsing until his nose bled. His sleep, when it came, was no sanctuary. He prowled the castle's cold, echoing corridors in the blue hours before dawn, barefoot and trembling, clutching a candle stub as he whispered to portraits that stared back with dead eyes. The faces of his ancestors, once proud, sharp-featured men, now seemed warped by the flickering light, their mouths twisted into smirks or frowns of condemnation. He smudged their frames with his own blood, drawing crosses and serpents, hissing, "They know, they saw, they lie." At every corner, he saw betrayal. Shadows lengthened into assassins. The sound of dripping water became a conspiratorial whisper. A cough in the distance echoed like a cannonade. He forbade mirrors in the palace entirely, convinced they showed not his face, but his sins, and that to gaze upon them too long would pull his soul through the glass into damnation. Servants began to wear amulets beneath their tunics, and priests left holy water sprinkled across thresholds without permission. One night, a kitchen boy fled the castle after swearing he saw Vlad standing motionless in the chapel for 6 hours, whispering to a skeleton no one else could see, his hands slick with blood as he traced an invisible circle on the flagstones. When a young monk, foolish, compassionate, or merely suicidal, offered to treat the prince's lesions with a tincture of herbs and oil, Vlad smiled, softly, as if touched. He beckoned the monk forward, extended his hand in apparent gratitude, and then, with eyes wide and shining with fever-mad clarity, whispered, "The devil wears cassock now, does he?" The monk was dragged into the hall before Vlad's evening meal, where his skin was peeled from him in strips as the prince dined, slowly, methodically, with shaking hands, each bite chewed 30 times. He never looked away. And when the man's screams turned hoarse and his body sagged like wet cloth, Vlad murmured, "One less spy for the Turk." The priests began to leave Holy Scripture pages outside his door, too afraid to enter. One page, drenched in something dark and sticky, was found with a message scrawled in Latin beneath Psalm 38. "I am silent and will not open my mouth, for it is thou who has done it." But Vlad no longer believed in silence. He spoke now only to phantoms, and the body he dragged from throne to bed and back again was not so much a vessel of flesh as a shrine of punishment, bloated, discolored, and ever oozing, a decaying altar to the god of pain he had made of himself. And still, he ruled. Because what, after all, is a throne, if not a coffin that thinks itself divine? By the waning weeks of autumn in the year 1476, the once iron body of Vlad the Impaler had become a festering reliquary of rot and agony, a vessel not of rulership, but of torment masquerading as power, his every movement accompanied by the wet slap of open flesh and the faint buzzing of flies drawn to sacred rot. The throne room, once a place of cold majesty and blood-drenched discipline, now breathed with a different life, a damp, fungal breath that rose from mold-veined stone and curtains stiff with dried excrement and prayer oil, mixing with the acrid perfume of suppurating flesh and candle wax. The boils beneath his arms had burst weeks prior, no longer discreet blisters but yawning mouths that wept pus and blood with each ragged inhale, forming crusted channels that trickled down his ribs and stained the cushions on which he sat. Immobile, shivering, yet still crowned. Beneath his groin, the veins had turned black and thick like the roots of an ancient tree corrupted by poison, crawling across his thighs in jagged tendrils, pulsing visibly through parchment-thin skin that split when he turned too sharply or stood too long. His urine, when it came, oozed in dark rivulets, thick as honey, reeking of metal and decay, and the chamber pot that bore it was emptied only under torchlight, by servants who wept silent tears behind kerchiefs soaked in vinegar. But it was not the corruption of his flesh that most horrified the court. It was the siege within his mind, the unraveling of reason that turned the prince from feared sovereign to something worse, a prophet of damnation, speaking in tongues none dared interpret. At night, he no longer whispered. He screamed, into the very stones of the castle, raving in fractured Latin, accusing the rafters of conspiring with the moon to steal his soul. He heard voices not only in his dreams, but in the walls, in the creaking of the beams, in the scuttling of vermin behind the tapestries, voices that murmured his name in tones both pitiful and mocking, like choir boys dragging knives through psalms. Every cough, every sneeze, every stammer from the lips of his servants became a sign, a message, an omen of betrayal. One scribe, an old man with a shaking hand, was flayed alive for poisoning parchment with ink drawn from Judas's bile. The general of his guard, a loyal veteran with a dozen scars in Vlad's name, was disemboweled in the courtyard after the prince dreamed he had fornicated with demons dressed as monks. A child was crucified upside down above the palace gate, his only crime being born on the same day as Vlad's illegitimate half-brother, a man the prince insisted had returned from the grave with a Turkish tongue in his mouth. And then came the purges, entire villages razed for soil sickness, as Vlad became convinced that the land itself had absorbed treachery like a sponge and must be wrung clean by starvation and fire. Crops were salted, wells were filled with lime and bones. Those who tried to flee were caught, branded with inverted crosses, and left naked in the forest to be eaten by wolves. Angels in fur, Vlad called them, God's true executioners. Within the halls of the court, there was no longer dialogue, only obedience and terror. His advisors no longer approached the throne with petitions or strategy, but with blank scrolls and bowed heads, offering silence as the only gift he would not kill them for. One minister attempted to speak a blessing before the meal, and choked mid-sentence as Vlad seized a fork and jammed it into the man's tongue, pinning it to the roof of his mouth before demanding that he finish the prayer in blood. By this time, the odor of the prince had become legend, a walking miasma of festering tissue and spiritual contagion. Servants scrubbed the flagstones with ox bile and lye after every audience, yet the stink of rotting man seeped from the walls like mold. Visitors from abroad returned home with tales of a monarch who ruled from a living tomb, his palace filled with the wailing of unseen things and the constant drip of some distant, unseen leak, though none could ever find the source. The monks of the nearby monastery began tolling their bells not by cannon hours, but by instinct, when the air grew too thick, when birds stopped singing, when a stillness fell across the land like a cloak of ash. One evening, without cause or warning, the bells tolled 13 times, and Vlad, upon hearing it, ordered the abbot dragged from his cell and drowned in a vat of horse blood, screaming that his soul must be dyed red before the devil drinks it. There were no trials, there were no sermons, only death. The monks buried the abbot in a shallow grave behind the stable, but by morning, his body had been dragged out by dogs, or by something else. His heart was missing, his eyes were sewn open, and through it all, Vlad stood, not like a man, but like a statue of agony, his body riddled with holes and his crown tilting to one side, as if even gold could no longer bear the weight of his skull. He saw no sin in cruelty anymore, no wickedness in blood. To him, cruelty was obedience, and pain was penance. God, he believed, had anointed him not with oil, but with plague, not with a scepter, but with ulcers. And so he wore his agony like a coronation robe, woven from thorns and soaked in fever. In his final days of autumn, when the leaves fell like the teeth of old men and the skies wept ash, Vlad did not fear death. He craved it, not as release, but as reward. For only in death, he whispered, could a true king be judged. And he was ready to stand before heaven not with prayer, but with proof. The boils, the screams, the drowned, the impaled. Let God count them. The night of December 26th, in the year of our Lord, 1476, arrived not as a blanket of peace, but as a blade, pale, curved, and cruel, a sickle-shaped moon carving through the blackness above the skeletal forests of Wallachia. No snow fell, yet the air carried the taste of iron and ash, a breath of something old and unholy slinking across the land. The bells had not rung that day. No hymns were sung. No candles were lit in the chapels, for even the monks, long resigned to death, sensed that the Virgin herself had turned her face away. In the shadow of the mountains, within the dripping throat of a narrow ravine whose walls were slick with moss and centuries of blood, Vlad the Impaler rode for the last time. Not with banners flying or drums echoing his fury, but hunched, shivering, and swaddled in lice-ridden wool, his breath rattling like dry leaves in a crypt, his gums cracked and bleeding as he whispered old battle prayers into the collar of his cloak. His entourage, fewer than 10 men, followed without word or question, their eyes flicking sideways, hands resting lightly upon their blades, as if they already knew what had been written in the stars that night. The nobles who summoned him, men whose foreheads had once kissed the stones before his throne, whose tongues had licked his boots, whose sons had trembled under the threat of impalement, stood at the edge of the gully, cloaked in silks that smelled of perfume and treason. They carried no torches. They made no sign of the cross. Instead, they bore a silver chalice and a velvet cloth, symbols not of peace, but of betrayal baptized in ritual. They told him they had gathered to offer clemency, to speak of reconciliation, to take communion beneath the moonlight as brothers. And Vlad, feverish, racked with sores, his jaw aching from days without sleep and nights filled with the gnashing teeth of spectral wolves, believed them, or at least pretended to. Perhaps he suspected. Perhaps he did not care. Perhaps somewhere within the torn tapestry of his mind, he saw the prophecy fulfilled, not of glory, but of sacrifice. For Christ, too, had been betrayed in a garden. As he dismounted, the fog thickened, rolling in like a burial shroud drawn slowly across the land. The ground beneath his boots was soft with decay, and the sound of his steps was muffled, as if even the earth did not want to remember this trespass. The moment his hand reached for the offered chalice, something snapped. Not a twig, but a truth. The men encircled him, weapons already drawn, faces pale and waxy in the moonlight like statues of mourning saints with broken halos. Vlad did not scream at first. Instead, he laughed, not with mirth, but with that high, brittle cackle that had echoed so often through the stone halls of Targovishte, the sound of a mind so shattered it no longer knew the difference between vengeance and surrender. He looked up at the moon, raised his arms as though nailed to a cross none could see, and spat blood toward the sky, hissing, "Saint Michael, coward of heaven, I will rise in 3 days, and the dead shall march behind me." They struck him from behind first, a coward's blow, a blade slipping between his ribs just below the shoulder. He buckled, but did not fall. Another slash opened his belly, spilling a coil of pink intestine into the snowless mud. Still he stood, clutching his own entrails with one hand and slapping away blades with the other, a feral beast too stubborn to die. Only when his kneecap was shattered with a mace did he collapse, shrieking with pain and fury, chewing his own tongue as blood fountained from his mouth. What followed was no execution. It was butchery. They tore the robe from his back, revealing boils crusted with filth and whip marks too fresh to be ceremonial. They shattered his jaw with a boot, gouged out his eyes with a rusted spoon brought for the purpose, and carved a crude cross into his chest. Not a blessing, but a mockery. He was not impaled once, but 3 times, as if the devil himself demanded a trinity of agony, once through the stomach, once through the anus, and once through the left thigh, pinning his twitching body to a felled tree, like a grotesque idol left as a warning to wolves. By the time the sun rose, his body had been stripped naked, gnawed by dogs, and left to rot in a ditch lined with frozen leaves and dung. His head, severed with dull blades and still grinning with purpled lips curled in a final sneer, was packed in salt and wrapped in black linen. They say his mouth kept moving long after the flesh stilled. Some say it whispered, others claim it wept. It was carried eastward by trembling hands and trembling hearts until it reached the gates of Constantinople, where the Ottoman Sultan unwrapped the parcel like a gift from hell itself. Those who witnessed the unveiling swore the room darkened. One servant retched until he collapsed. Another swore he saw a snake slither from Vlad's mouth and vanish beneath the throne. The head was nailed to a spike and placed in the royal garden, where eunuchs and poets passed by in silence, unwilling to speak the name of the man who once made forests of the dead. And so Dracula, the Impaler, the Scourge, the Blood Prince of Wallachia, became a relic, a warning, a shrunken thing gnawed by dogs and spat upon by history. But even in death, he refused to be forgotten. The head arrived in Constantinople beneath a moonless sky, bound in black cloth, weeping brine through its stitching as if it still mourned its flesh. The guards who bore it did not ride, but walked, not out of reverence, but superstition, for none dared elevate the severed crown of Vlad the Impaler above their own. They said the weight of the relic was unnatural, that it grew heavier with each step through the city gates, as if the damned soul within were dragging its chains across unseen thresholds. By the time the head reached the Sultan's court, the cloth that once concealed it had begun to twitch, not with wind or movement, but with life. A crawling, wet agitation that suggested maggots had not only found their feast, but had begun to multiply. The stink that accompanied it seeped through the palace walls, worming its way into silk curtains and the nostrils of eunuchs who, though hardened by years of execution and intrigue, gagged openly, covering their mouths with perfumed sleeves as the basket was placed on a slab of polished marble in the center of the throne room. Silence fell like a guillotine. Candles flickered despite the stillness of the air, and a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost human, emerged from the basket, like breath passing through dead lips. Some claimed it was the wind. Others said it was a final prayer being uttered through clenched teeth sewn shut by trembling hands. When the cloth was pulled away, even the Sultan, a man who had ordered the deaths of thousands without blinking, stepped backward, not in awe, but in revulsion. The head of Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, impaler of men and butcher of nations, sat upon a silver platter, its flesh bloated and green around the edges, the lips puckered and twisted as though frozen mid-curse. The eyes, though clouded, retained a wet shine, a glimmer of furious recognition that made more than one courtier drop to their knees and mutter protective verses under their breath. The beard, once a regal mantle of authority, was now matted with clots of blood and wriggling with pale worms that burrowed beneath the skin as if seeking out the brain they had once feared to touch. The mouth had been sewn shut, yes, but poorly. The stitches, too thin and too few, strained against the pressure from within, so that the lips bulged grotesquely, leaking blood and bile in slow pulses. It was said that when the Sultan leaned close, he heard a whisper, not in sound, but in thought, a cold voice in the marrow of his bones that said, "You feast now, but I am never done." Priests were summoned at once, not to bless, but to bind, their chants echoing off the vaulted ceilings like thunder trapped inside bone. One sprinkled holy water, which hissed and steamed upon contact with the head's brow. Another waved incense, only for the censer to crack down the middle, spilling embers across the floor. The Sultan, now pale, ordered that the relic be buried at once, beneath 7 stones and surrounded by pork fat, the most unclean material in the empire's theology, a seal of blasphemy meant to repel the dead. But that night, none slept. A kitchen servant swore she saw the eyes twitch. Another boy, sent to empty chamber pots, was found weeping in the garden, speaking in Wallachian, a language he had never learned. And the wolves, though Constantinople was a city of stone and sea, were heard howling in the courtyards, their cries bouncing between minarets as if called. By morning, the grave was disturbed. The dirt churned, the fat scattered. The silver marker engraved with the word traitor had been snapped clean in 2, and the head, the awful, stinking, blasphemous head, was gone. Some said the Sultan had it burned in secret, the flames fed with heretic bones and sealed with silence. Others whispered that it walked the tunnels beneath the palace, blind and grinning, devouring rats and whispering to chained prisoners. A few even claimed it had never arrived at all, that the basket was a decoy, and Vlad's true remains had risen 3 nights later, just as he had once promised beneath the Judas moon. But the most terrifying rumor, the one no one dared speak aloud in daylight, was that the head had never truly died, that it had only been waiting in salt and silence for its body to find it again, and that in some forgotten crypt, far from torchlight and reason, it had begun to whisper once more. There was no procession, no marbled tomb, no inked elegy chanted by choirs beneath gilded domes. Only dirt, bile, and silence. Vlad the Impaler, once a prince, then a scourge, then a legend whispered through clenched teeth, died not in battle nor in glory, but as a bloated carcass whose name was spoken less in reverence than in fear, as one might invoke a curse while hoping not to awaken it. His body, torn, defiled, eaten, discarded, was buried in haste and without honor, the final insult to a life built entirely upon the spectacle of death. But his story, that festering chain of gore, fire, and superstition, did not vanish. It lingered, like the odor that clung to his corpse, seeping into the soil of Wallachia, into its cracked monasteries and rotting chapels, into the bones of its orphans and the dreams of its madmen. Even as his name dissolved in the mouths of peasants and his banner crumbled into dust, something remained, a residue, not of memory, but of dread, the kind that curdles milk and halts songs mid-note. In his final days, he ceased to be a man and became instead a warning, a relic, a rotting idol set atop a mound of his own sins. His body, riddled with plague, hallucination, and betrayal, served as the mirror through which an entire dynasty witnessed its own decay. His mind, once sharp enough to carve nations from chaos, was reduced to ash and muttering, a voice echoing in empty halls to no one but ghosts and rats. The empire he tried to raise collapsed before his bones had cooled. Wallachia fractured, bled, and devoured itself. Nobles he once ruled through fear became scavengers, each clawing for scraps of power from the carcass of his reign. Villages he had purified with fire now succumbed to plague and hunger, and the palaces that echoed with the cries of the impaled stood hollow, their doors rotting from disuse, their windows dark. Even his bloodline dissolved, not into martyrdom, but into oblivion, exiled and reviled, their name a blight whispered only in punishment. And yet, he is remembered, not as he truly was, a dying tyrant rotting from the inside, covered in boils, dragging himself through candlelit corridors, whispering to icons slick with blood. That truth was too human, too grotesque, too real. No, what endured was the mask, the fangs, the cape, the immortal prince of shadows who drinks blood, not because he suffers, but because he dominates. A lie, beautiful and clean, born from filth and ruin. But beneath that lie, beneath every flicker of vampire myth and every whisper of Dracula, lies the true horror. Not a monster with fangs, but a man consumed by power who believed pain was a sacrament and cruelty a virtue. A man who ruled not through love nor law, but through terror, and who died surrounded by none of the things he killed for. Because terror is not eternal. It decays, it rots, and even the most terrifying throne, if built from bones, will one day crumble beneath the weight of flies. So let the world remember what it will. Let it dress him in crimson and call him eternal. But the soil remembers differently. The trees that grew in his killing fields bend strangely in the wind. The wells dug near his fortress still curdle with sulfur, and the peasants who do not know Latin still make the sign of the cross at night, whispering prayers not for salvation, but for silence. And somewhere, in the forgotten crypts, in the forests where the air grows too still, in the corners of the old churches where the light never quite reaches, the flies still come, not to feed, not to flee, but to worship.